I'm taking half your millions, including your grandmother's estate. Bradley spat with a smug grin, his voice thick and cold as ice in a glass of whiskey, rolling around the courtroom as if he were announcing the winning numbers of a lottery, where the grand prize was me and everything that was left of my family. The certainty with which he said it was so disgusting that a chill ran down my spine, but I gritted my teeth and forced myself to sit still at the defendant's table, as if my calm alone would ruin his entire carefully orchestrated game. My name is Elizabeth Brownford, and at 45, I never in my wildest dreams imagined that I would be here in Nashville, in a stuffy family courthouse, surrounded by the smoky smell of old wood paneling, listening to the man I once trusted the way a child trusts in the light, trying to rip out of my hands everything I had worked for all my life, everything that my grandmother, the only person who had never betrayed me, left me. Bradley sat across the room from me next to his lawyer, and he looked as if he was already celebrating, as if he had just pulled out a lucky ticket, and everyone in the room should applaud his good fortune. His expensive suit, bought, of course, with my money, with my bonuses, with my sleepless nights at the office, fit him perfectly, and his golden hair was slicked back in that sleek motion that once made my heart beat faster, but now made me feel only bitterness and nausea. "Your Honor," his lawyer intoned, smiling as if he were enjoying every word, "my client is entitled to half of all marital property, including the inheritance Mrs. Brownford received during the marriage." I noticed how the lawyer's briefcase was bulging with papers, every page prepared to scrub me dry, every word aimed at taking even the scent of my grandmother's perfume from the old scarf I still had. I saw the spectators in the courtroom lean forward as if they were watching a cheap show where my life was up for auction. Some of them were probably right there, calculating how many millions would end up in Bradley's pocket. And the journalists who had come for the scandal had their pens ready to rip the headlines out of my pain. Judge Richardson, a woman in her 60s with cold eyes and steely hair, looked up from her papers. In 20 years in family court, she must have seen thousands of stories like this, and yet I sensed that what I was about to show was different. She didn't yet know what trump card I held in my purse, didn't suspect how far Bradley had gone in his greed. He turned slightly towards me, the corners of his lips lifting in a smile, and the movement sent a wave of anger through me, so intense that I had to resist jumping up and shouting it all at once. This man who once brought me coffee in bed and kissed my temple, whispering that he loved me just the way I was a lying predator, sitting now in an expensive suit and waiting for the judge to bang his gavel and legitimize his theft. 5 years of marriage had been a deception. 5 years of my life he had built a theater in which I played the role of a naive woman who believed in his fairy tales. The courtroom, smelling of old wood and cold paper, pressed down on me, and the traffic outside was a reminder that the city was going about its business as usual while I was being stripped in front of a crowd. I clutched my purse tighter, holding the envelope heavy as lead, but promising to change everything. "Mrs. Brownford," Judge Richardson finally looked straight at me, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Do you have a response to these allegations?" I rose slowly, my heart pounding so hard even the reporters in the back row could hear it. But I was more determined than I had ever been before. This was my moment, the moment when his insatiable greed would finally become his curse. "Your Honor, I believe the court needs to see something," I said, my fingers tightening around the envelope until my nails rang. I knew I was on the edge, and yet deep down I regretted it, for ignoring the signs that had been there all along. When Bradley came into my life, I was in my early 40s, carrying the weight of Brightville Vale Analytics, a company I'd built from scratch by consulting with small businesses and helping people get out of debt. I was a proud but lonely woman, tired of endless spreadsheets and numbers. My grandmother, my only real friend, had died 3 years earlier, and her loss had left a hole in me that nothing could fill. And then that year, I met him, Bradley, at a business conference in Memphis. He was charming, too charming, and there was an interest in his eyes that I mistook for genuine admiration. He listened to my reports. He praised my work. He leaned toward me and whispered, "You're a genius, Elizabeth. I've never met anyone who understands numbers like you." I thought he saw in me a woman worthy of love and respect. I thought I'd finally met a man who valued my mind. Now, standing before the court with his smile fixed on me, I realized that all this time he had been counting something else. Not my merits, not my talent, but my fortune, the numbers in the accounts, my grandmother's inheritance, every cent he dreamed of making his own. Our courtship took me on a whirlwind of expensive restaurants with white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and dishes I couldn't even pronounce, and trips to romantic places where everything looked like it belonged on a postcard. And I remember how it all seemed like an incredible gift from fate, because suddenly I was with a man who could not just look me in the eye, but look as if the whole world were reflected in it. Bradley was then a sales manager for some pharmaceutical company, not the kind of job that would involve millions in the bank, but somehow he always had the money to order a limo, rent a suite, or take me to the theater. And when I doubted where it all came from, he would put his hand on mine and say in a low, confident voice, "I believe in investing in those I care about." These words sounded so convincing, so warm, that I allowed myself not to think that his investment was not an investment in love, but in a future jackpot. I was flattered. I was blinded by this attention and his generosity. I did not see that in each of his smiles there was already a calculation, that behind each kiss there was a carefully constructed strategy. And when, 8 months later, he got down on one knee, I did not immediately say, yes. Somewhere in the depths of my heart, my grandmother's warning stirred, her eternal caution, her quiet voice that sounded in me since childhood. "Beware of men who are in a hurry, Judy. Good men never rush." But Bradley was persistent, and his argument was life itself. "Life is too short to wait," he whispered in my ear. "I know what I want. I want you." He had done everything to make me lose myself in the moment. A private dinner on a riverboat, a table by the window, soft candlelight, a quartet playing our songs, the ones we laughed and danced to when the world seemed cloudless. And when he pulled out the ring, a massive one, with a stone that shimmered with all the lights of the city at night, I knew only one thing. It was worth more than his salary for a whole year, but I brushed that thought aside, drowned in his promises. My lawyer, Patricia Hallbrook, always stood guard over my interests, and at that moment she said bluntly, "You are a successful woman, Elizabeth. You need a prenuptial agreement. It's not romance, it's protection." I remember how awkward I was to bring up this subject, how afraid I was that Bradley would think I suspected him of hunting for my money, that I trusted numbers and signatures more than our future. But his reaction was unexpected. He laughed, waved me away with a slight wave of his hand, and said, "Of course, dear. Whatever suits you. I'm not marrying you for the money. I'm marrying you for you." He didn't even read the papers, just grabbed a pen and signed the name with a broad, almost theatrical smile, adding with mock seriousness, "Love doesn't need small print." And in that moment, I believed him. I felt relieved because he had dispelled my doubts as easily as if they were just a child's whim. Patricia drew up the document as carefully as a surgeon stitches up a wound, carefully listing every detail, my current assets, my future business income, and any inheritance that might come to me. "Your grandmother's property will one day be in your hands," she reminded me, looking me in the eye. "It should stay in your family." "That's where it belongs." I thought she was being overly dramatic, that this was an overstatement that would probably never be needed. I was wrong, and I learned it too late. The real shock came a year and a half later when I got the call that changed everything. A lawyer called to tell me my grandmother's inheritance, all her property, everything she had treasured, was going to me. The house with the white porch and the garden where we spent summer evenings, her investments, her collection of rare books smelling of old paper and history, and most importantly, $2.8 million, invested and managed so skillfully that I could not even imagine how much it was. I remember sitting there with the phone in my hand, stunned, as if I had suddenly found myself in another world, and I hadn't yet had time to realize what it meant when I told Bradley. His reaction was the first crack in our fairy tale. His eyes lit up so brightly, as if I had just handed him the keys to heaven. $2.8 million, he repeated, and his voice trembled with excitement. Elizabeth, we are rich. He said we, but it sounded like I, and this should have been a signal for me, the first alarm bell, but then I only laughed, thinking that he shared my joy. From that day on, I began to notice how his behavior changed, how his habits became different, as if he had finally taken off the mask, and I realized that along with my grandmother's inheritance, not only my life had changed, but Bradley himself. His needs, his appetites, his face greedily turned to the future, where money had become the main love, and I was just a bridge to it. 6 months after my grandmother's millions entered my life, Bradley suddenly announced that he was tired of his job at the pharmaceutical company, that he had outgrown sales, and now wanted to explore new opportunities, to be with me, to support my success, to share my journey to the top. He said it with such pomp, with such confidence, that for a moment I even felt guilty, as if his decision to quit his job was a sacrifice for me. But the truth was dirty and simple. He spent my money as if it were his pocket change, throwing it around without looking back, and every new day he came up with a way to burn another wad of bills. First he bought a car, a shiny, booming beast that cost more than I would ever spend on transportation. To build connections, he said with a wink, as if he was going to sign contracts just because his sedan shone like a mirror. Then, without a word, without consulting me, he invested in his friend's restaurant. And when a year later the business collapsed, leaving a hole of $30,000, he just shrugged and said, "Well, not everything has to be successful." He booked expensive tours, joined an elite golf club, as if he had always belonged to this world of expensive suits and gold watches, began to dress as if he was born into a family with a fortune, although only yesterday he was telling me how he got by on cheap pizzas as a student. And every time I allowed myself to doubt, or at least ask, "Are you sure this is wise?" he looked at me with the same offensive look and said in a soft but firm voice, "We are partners, Elizabeth. And partners trust each other, especially in financial decisions." These words became for him a shield with which he covered his own greed and recklessness. The turning point came 6 months ago, when I accidentally discovered that Bradley had been telling everyone at his country club that my grandmother's money was our family money, that the inheritance belonged to both of us. He was introducing himself as an investor, an entrepreneur, the new face of business, when his only capital was my family's years of labor. He didn't say a word that each of his investment projects was built on someone else's inheritance, namely what my grandmother had carefully saved for me. I caught him in this lie, and along with the lie came a torrent of accusations, as if he were waiting for the moment to rip off the mask and show me his true face. He began to defend himself, and then he went on the offensive, his words turning into blows, and each sentence hurt more than the last. "You act like it's a secret that I'm your husband," he shouted. "Everyone knows you need someone like me to enjoy life. Before me, you were just a lonely workaholic with no friends, no joy, no real connection." I listened to him, and my heart broke in two, because there was some truth in those words. Yes, I was alone. Yes, I buried myself in work. I lived between spreadsheets and graphs, and it was he who brought into my life parties, travel, the company of friends I would never have met on my own. But now I saw clearly. All this was part of his long game, part of a scenario in which he was my savior. But in reality, he was just a predator, methodically fooling me in order to take over everything I had inherited. The last straw was the correspondence I discovered between Bradley and his lawyer, in which they, coldly and cynically, discussed strategy for the upcoming divorce. They had been planning this for months, biding their time to get the maximum amount of money out of me, discussing Tennessee laws, exploring loopholes where they could back me into the wall and prove that his emotional support and investment in my lifestyle entitled him to a bigger piece of the pie. And then something inside me flipped. I called Patricia again, the woman who had once insisted on a prenuptial agreement, and filed for divorce myself, not allowing Bradley to control the situation or choose the timing. If he wanted a war for my grandmother's money, I was willing to give it to him, but on my terms and with my cards. Now, standing here in this echoing, stuffy courtroom, I knew the moment had come. I leaned over to my purse, pulled out the manila envelope Patricia had been preparing for this day, and felt the air in the courtroom become thick and heavy. The rustling of paper sounded louder than any scream. The air conditioner hummed somewhere above, but all eyes were on me. I stepped toward the judge's table, and for the first time something like fear flashed across Bradley's face, his smug smile flickering like a crack in glass. "Your Honor," I said, my voice level and firmer than I expected myself to be. "The court must see this document before it discusses the division of property." Judge Richardson extended her hand, her fingers firmly clasped around the envelope. "What is this document, Mrs. Brownford?" she asked, without changing her tone. I looked Bradley in the eye, held his gaze, and said, "It's a prenuptial agreement, Your Honor. The same one my husband signed before we got married 5 years ago." The atmosphere in the courtroom changed instantly, as if electricity had been sent through the wires. The air grew heavy, people's faces tensed, and in every glance there was that special curiosity that comes when someone smells a scandal about to explode. Bradley's lawyer, a lanky, dry man named Gerald Weston, jumped up from his seat as if he'd been electrocuted and shouted, "Your Honor, we were not informed of any prenuptial agreement. This is unacceptable. This is a violation of procedure." But Judge Richardson didn't even blink, her voice firm and authoritative. "Sit down, Mr. Weston." She was already opening the envelope, removing the seal as calmly as if she'd done it 100 times. "I'll examine the documents and determine their validity myself." I returned to my seat and kept my eyes on Bradley, because in the space of 30 seconds, his face had gone from a smug mask to a confused, almost panicked grimace. He whispered feverishly to Gerald, clutching at his sleeve, and I could only make out fragments. "She never said..." How could that be? The words sounded like music to me, like sweet retribution for everything he had done. Patricia Hallbrook sat next to me, completely silent and majestic, as if she were the one conducting this performance. She had been preparing this moment for months, down to the smallest detail, and now everything was happening exactly as she had predicted. "Just watch," she whispered to me with a small, almost invisible smile, and I felt how, for the first time in a long time, I woke up with confidence. Judge Richardson turned the pages slowly, deliberately, lingering on each one, her face stony, but each movement seemed decisive. The document was perfect, drawn up with the precision of a surgeon. It clearly spelled out which assets were protected, which debts remained my personal responsibility, and most importantly, it stated that any inheritance I made would remain mine alone. I saw my grandmother again, her eyes, her words, and a wave of gratitude rose up inside me for the woman who had always known how to protect me even after her death. "It appears to be a prenuptial agreement, properly drawn up," the judge finally said, and her words rang out like a bell in the courtroom. "It is dated 6 weeks before your wedding, notarized by 2 notaries, and signed by both parties." At that moment, Bradley's attorney sank into his chair as if he had been shaken out of his insides, his face as gray as old paper. I realized Gerald Weston had filed for division of property without even bothering to check the basics. He, like Bradley, was sure that I would be defenseless, that my entire fortune was easy prey. "Your Honor!" Bradley suddenly jumped up, his voice wavering, losing its former velvety tone. "I need to see this document. I don't remember signing anything like this." The judge raised her eyebrows and her gaze pierced him. "Mr. Brownford, stay where you are and let your lawyer handle this case." But Bradley didn't hear her. He was spiraling downward, losing control. "Elizabeth, what is this paper?" he cried, turning to me. "You never said this was some kind of legal trap." His voice broke, and there was no longer a drop of the confident charmer he always presented himself as. "Mr. Brownford." Judge Richardson's voice cracked like a whip. "You will remain silent, or I will have you held in contempt of court. Your attorney has the right to request that the document be reviewed in the prescribed manner." Gerald Weston stood up reluctantly, as if he were being dragged to execution, and approached the judge's table to look at the agreement. I watched his face and saw how it grew paler with each page, how his mouth tightened into a thin line and his eyes lost the last of their confidence. Returning to his seat, he leaned over to Bradley and whispered something to him in despair. But Bradley only shook his head, as if he could not believe his own defeat. The courtroom was silent, and in this silence one could clearly hear the whispers of the spectators, the scratching of the pens of the reporters, greedily catching every word, every gesture, every detail of the public humiliation of Bradley, who had recently sat with the air of a winner. "Your Honor," Gerald finally said, his tone lacking the brash confidence of an hour ago, "my client would like to request a short recess so that I can review these documents more thoroughly." Judge Richardson glanced at her watch, then back at him. "Mr. Weston," her words were cold and clipped, "did you not conduct the required disclosure of any prenuptial agreements before filing a suit for division of property?" There was a silence in the courtroom, and Gerald's silence was the most telling answer. Bradley was so confident in his infallibility and in the smooth running of his carefully constructed scam that he had neglected to mention the prenuptial agreement to his own attorney, as if it were some forgotten detail rather than a document that could ruin his entire plan in an instant. Gerald Weston looked as stunned as his client, his eyes wide, his face drawn, his hands visibly shaking as he tried to string words together into a coherent sentence. "I'll give you 10 minutes to review the document," Judge Richardson said dryly and ruthlessly, as if she already knew the outcome of this game. "But I warn you, this is a legally binding agreement that directly affects all of your client's claims." The recess became a performance in itself. I sat motionless, but I watched every detail as if I were watching a movie of my own life. Bradley and Gerald had moved toward the courtroom windows, and their figures against the bright daylight looked as if they were both trapped in a cage. Bradley's gestures were becoming more and more violent and desperate. He was waving his arms, grabbing Gerald's elbow, pounding his fist into his palm, as if he could change reality with the power of his gestures. Gerald, on the other hand, remained coolly reserved, but his face betrayed a heavy doom. And even from the other side of the courtroom, I could catch the moment when Bradley realized that it was all over. His plan had fallen apart. Patricia took advantage of the pause to look over her notes again, turning the pages as calmly as if checking a shopping list, and said quietly to me, "He will try to claim fraud or coercion. That's typical. Such men never admit their own guilt. They are always looking for someone to blame." I knew she was right, and yet I clenched my hands so hard that my nails dug into the skin, because I knew that the last scene of this performance was ahead. When the hearing resumed, Gerald Weston was the first to rise, as if he wanted to seize the initiative. "Your Honor," he said loudly, although there was a tremor in his voice, "my client believes that he has been misled as to the nature of this document. Mrs. Brownford presented it as a mere romantic formality, not as a comprehensive asset protection agreement." Judge Richardson looked up, and her eyes flashed cold metal. "Mr. Weston," she said slowly, drawing out each word, "are you saying that your client signed a legal document without bothering to read it?" "Your Honor," Gerald quickly replied, "my client trusted his wife to explain the nature of the agreement honestly." I almost laughed out loud. Bradley, who had always boasted of his insight, boasted of his ability to see through people and control any situation. was now being portrayed by his lawyer as a gullible simpleton who took a woman at her word. It was so pathetic and absurd that I could hardly help but snort. The document is clearly labeled as a prenuptial agreement, Judge Richardson observed, leafing through the pages as if she were scolding a child for not learning her lesson. There is the standard disclaimer about the right to independent counsel. Did your client voluntarily waive that right? Gerald shuffled nervously through the papers as if he hoped to find an answer that would change the course of the case. Yes, Your Honor. My client waived it. And the agreement was notarized, correct? In his presence, Mr. Brownford's identity was verified? Yes, Your Honor, Gerald managed. Then the judge looked up sharply and stared straight at Bradley, piercing him with her gaze. Mr. Brownford, tell the court, when you signed this document, were you pressured? Were you forced? Coerced? Bradley's face flushed bright red. He fidgeted in his chair, clenched his fists, and finally said through clenched teeth, "No, Your Honor." But I thought it was just a formality. Elizabeth made it clear it didn't matter. Did you read the document before you signed it? The judge's question hung in the air, heavy and inevitable, like a stone over an abyss. Bradley's eyes darted around the courtroom, as if he were looking for someone to pull him out of this trap. But the courtroom was silent. The silence became so thick that it seemed you could touch it, and everyone present felt how the moment was becoming increasingly awkward. Mr. Brownford, I asked you a direct question. The judge's voice was cold as ice. I skimmed it, Bradley finally breathed, and the admission sounded like a sentence. But Elizabeth said it was just a formality. Judge Richardson's expression was icy, the look of someone accustomed to seeing human folly in all its forms. Mr. Brownford, she said, measuring each word, you signed a legal document without reading it, voluntarily waiving your right to counsel, and now you ask the court to invalidate it simply because you failed to take it seriously. The courtroom was so silent you could almost hear an old wristwatch ticking in someone's pocket, and even the reporters, who had been scribbling away on their notepads, paused, transfixed by the spectacle of Bradley's public collapse. I felt a surge of dark satisfaction, almost sweet, as I watched him writhe under the judge's icy gaze, his smugness turning to clammy fear, his confidence to an undisguised panic. Your Honor. Gerald made a last desperate attempt, hanging on to each word as if it were a life preserver. Perhaps we could argue that the agreement was unconscionable, given the obvious inadequacy of Mr. Brownford's position. But Richardson cut him off so abruptly that there was a collective gasp of surprise in the courtroom. Have you reviewed the financial information attached to this prenuptial agreement? Her voice was dry as a whip. Gerald flipped through the document quickly, the pages rustling like autumn leaves, and a shadow of horror crossed the lawyer's face as he realized what he had missed. Yes, Your Honor, he muttered. There is extensive financial information presented here. Indeed, Mrs. Brownford provided full documentation of her assets, income, and expected inheritance. Your client has signed an acknowledgement that he has read and understood everything. Richardson narrowed her eyes slightly. This is one of the most detailed prenuptial agreements I have ever seen in 23 years of practice, she said with obvious force, and the words sank like knives into Bradley's soul. He sat as if in a torture chair, his face waxy white, then pink, then mottled, as if the blood were dancing chaotically through his veins. He gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white and muttered loud enough for the nearby benches to hear, "This can't be legal." But the judge continued, as if he hadn't heard her desperate prattle. Section 6, her voice boomed across the courtroom, deals with spousal support. Quote, neither party is entitled to alimony or spousal maintenance from the other, regardless of the length of the marriage or the difference in income. She looked up, giving Bradley a long look. This section is initialed by both parties and notarized. I could see Gerald scribbling notes out of the corner of my eye, as if his life depended on it, but it was like the pathetic spasms of a man drowning in a swamp, each stroke only pulling him deeper. 5 years ago, Patricia had drawn up the contract so meticulously that she had left no loopholes. I stood up. My heart was pounding like a drum, but my voice was firm. Your Honor, if I may, I would like to address the court. The judge nodded. Go ahead, Mrs. Brownford. I took a deep breath and spoke each word like a mantra. When I inherited my grandmother's estate 18 months ago, I immediately consulted an attorney to confirm that the estate was protected by a prenuptial agreement. We made sure it fell under Section 4, subsection B. I kept the estate in separate accounts, and it was never mixed with our joint funds or the proceeds of the marriage. With that, I watched Bradley's face fall into the gray abyss and knew that this was the final nail in his coffin. Therefore, I added, he has no legal claim on the money. The judge nodded, and for the first time her expression softened. Mrs. Brownford, did you use any of the inheritance for marital expenses or joint purchases? No, Your Honor, I answered firmly. I covered the household expenses entirely from my regular income. The inheritance was kept entirely separate, and then Bradley couldn't take it anymore. His voice cut through the silence with a sharp cry. That's a lie. She bought us things. She paid for our vacations. His face twisted and he leaned forward as if he were ready to bite the air. Mr. Brownford, Judge Richardson's voice struck the courtroom like a cold blade. You are not well. Sit down immediately. But Bradley was already beyond all reason, and it was obvious to the naked eye. His carefully polished facade of pathos and confidence simply shattered into pieces right before the eyes of the audience. This is madness, he screamed, his voice breaking like a rusty old piano. I was with her for 5 years. I stood by her. I sacrificed everything for her. I gave up my career for our marriage. And then I couldn't help myself. The words came out of my mouth, quiet and venomous as a snake bite. You quit your job to spend my money. Mrs. Brownford, Judge Richardson warned, but I caught a hint of warm, hidden amusement in her voice, and it only added fuel to the fire. Gerald tugged at Bradley's jacket sleeve, trying to pull him back into his chair, but he had already broken loose. His true nature had come out, shrill, greedy, pathetic. She trapped me, he screamed, clutching at the air. She made me think we were partners. She let me believe the money was ours. Mr. Brownford, Richardson's voice cut through the courtroom like an iron rod on concrete. If you cannot control yourself, I will have the bailiff remove you from here immediately. The threat finally broke through his rage. Bradley sat back heavily on the bench, his chest heaving like the bellows of an old forge. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and everyone in the courtroom saw him for what he really was. A greedy, smug man who had married me for my money and who had the nerve to play the victim when his fraudulent scheme had collapsed. Richardson slowly, with studied care, turned the last pages of the prenuptial agreement, and the tension in the courtroom grew thick and sticky, like a thunderstorm before a bolt of lightning. Everyone waited for her verdict. I sat still, a calm, thick satisfaction washing over me. After months of his lies, his manipulations, his cold calculations, the truth was finally laid out on the table. Based on my review of the prenuptial agreement, Judge Richardson said, her voice ringing in the silence, I am prepared to make a judgment on the division of property. She took off her glasses and her gaze fixed on Bradley, cold as steel, capable of freezing fire. Mr. Brownford, her words cut the air. This prenuptial agreement is valid, comprehensive, and fully enforceable. You have no right to any of your wife's prenuptial property, inheritance, or business. The words hit him like a hammer on glass. Bradley sat there, his jaw hanging open, his eyes wide and blank and bewildered, as if he'd believed he could get out of this. Nothing, he croaked, barely audible, as if he couldn't believe he'd said it. Nothing, the judge said calmly. Furthermore, she continued, her voice growing even heavier, under Section 7 of this agreement, all debts incurred by either party separately remain the sole responsibility of that party. Mrs. Brownford, do you have any documentation of the debts incurred solely by your husband? Patricia handed me a thick folder without further ado. I handed it to the bailiff and said calmly, "Yes, Your Honor." "These are credit cards, a car loan, bad restaurant investments, and country club dues. The total is approximately $87,000. At this point, Bradley's attorney looked like he wanted to disappear into thin air. His face went limp, his eyes darted around the courtroom as if looking for a way out, but there was no way out. The case, on which he had hoped to make himself a solid fee and fame, turned out to be a complete disaster for him. "Mr. Brownford," Judge Richardson's voice was merciless, "not only will you not receive any assets from this marriage, but you will also be personally liable for the $87,000 of debt you have accumulated during your life together." The courtroom immediately came alive, exploding with a buzz and whispers. Someone behind me couldn't help but burst out laughing. In just half an hour, Bradley had gone from dreaming of millions to the smell of imminent bankruptcy. "Your Honor?" His voice sounded as if there was no air left in it. "This cannot be. 5 years of marriage should mean something." Richardson smiled slightly, and it was a razor-sharp smile. "That does mean something, Mr. Brownford. It's called a costly lesson in why you should read legal documents before you sign them." The gavel came down with such finality that the sound of it echoed through the courtroom like thunder from a clear sky. "The court grants the petition for divorce filed by Mrs. Brownford," Judge Richardson said, and there was no hesitation in her voice. "No assets are transferred to Mr. Brownford. All personal debts remain with the party that incurred them. The court is adjourned." Her words hung in the air like a sentence, and all the tension of the last few months seemed to recede, giving way to a thick silence in which someone could be heard sighing heavily in the back row. Bradley sat there dumbfounded, his eyes darting around the empty walls of the room, as if he were searching for an answer that no longer existed. He had spent 5 years of his life preparing for this moment, plotting, smiling at the right times, playing on pity, and in the end it had all come crashing down because he had carelessly signed a prenuptial agreement at the start, without even looking at its contents. I watched him and saw all the illusions crumbling in his head, and the process was excruciatingly slow, painful, like watching his own collapse in slow motion. People began to leave the room, reporters rose from their seats, but I remained seated, watching Bradley's world crumble beneath his feet. Gerald Weston was already hurriedly gathering up his papers and putting them in his briefcase. His movements were sharp, almost nervous, as if he wanted to disappear from this scene of shame as quickly as possible. Several journalists, sensing the sensation, rushed to ask questions, but Patricia, as always, was quicker, stepping between them and me, her voice firm and professional. "No comment now." "Elizabeth!" Bradley suddenly shouted as I rose from the bench. His voice sounded desperate, like the cry of a drowning man. "We need to talk about this. It's not over." I turned and looked at him one last time, and in that moment my voice contained all the calm I had been missing for the past months. "Bradley, it all ended the moment you decided to marry me for money, not for love. The prenuptial agreement didn't ruin your plan. Your greed did." I saw his face twist, as if he had swallowed something bitter, and realized that there was no way out. The full weight of his new situation finally hit him. No inheritance, no assets, and a mountain of debt that would hang over him for years to come. The man who had so skillfully charmed people, who had managed to walk into any room looking like a winner, found himself for the first time in a situation where smiles and persuasion did not work. I walked toward the door next to Patricia, each step easier than the last. It was as if my body had cast off the iron chains with which it had been bound throughout the marriage. The nightmare was over, and now his true nature was on display so vividly that no one could deny it any longer. And this was not only justice, it was poetry in action, with a touch of cruel irony. A few months after the divorce, I learned that Bradley's life had completely fallen apart. $87,000 in debt had crushed him so much that within 6 months he had been forced to declare bankruptcy. His credit history was destroyed. All his attempts to lead a normal life had been dashed by harsh reality. His reputation in the Nashville business community had evaporated like smoke. Everyone knew the story of his attempt to steal his wife's inheritance, and it had become a small local legend about the dangers of marrying for money and the benefits of a prenuptial agreement. The country club where he used to strut around like he owned the place threw him out for non-payment of dues. His shiny car was repossessed, and he was forced to take buses and taxis, which was worse than a death sentence for Bradley. The women he used to flirt with and make plans with turned their backs on him one by one, warning each other of a gold digger who hid naked greed behind a smile. Eventually, he moved back in with his elderly parents in Memphis, and his career was reduced to a dull job in sales. His dreams of living off my grandmother's money burned to the ground, and at 47 he was alone, in debt, and with a damaged reputation. I decided to use part of my inheritance in a way that would benefit others. Thus was born the Crawford Foundation, a foundation that helps women negotiate prenuptial agreements, counsels them, and defends them in court against the same financial predators that Bradley turned out to be. I wanted to ensure that no woman ever again finds herself in a situation where her love is turned into a business deal. And when I look back on my journey from a naive, trusting wife to a woman who stood up for everything that belonged to her family, I realize that my grandmother's wisdom saved me from more than just financial ruin. She saved me from a life in which I was exploited by a man who saw my love only as a way to make easy money.